Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Webdelics podcast, where we're on a journey to find out the truth about plant medicines, to get rid of the myths and change the narrative. I'm your host, Scott Mason, and with us today is our guest, David Cox, a freelance health journalist who has written provocative and cutting-edge articles on a whole variety of medical topics, including psychedelics and plant medicine. Now, David comes at this topic truly from a place of authority because he's a former Cambridge University neuroscientist and mental health researcher. I'm trembling a little bit inside even saying it. It's so impressive. His journalism has appeared in The Guardian, BBC News, Wired, Time Magazine, and others. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Scott. I hope I can live up to that wonderful billing you've just given me.
Well, we'll let the audience decide that, but I have complete confidence in it, especially when we consider the topic that we're discussing today, which is, broadly speaking, the relationship of the plant medicine and psychedelic movement to traditional Western medicine. Now, I'm going to start by doing what I just can't help myself. I've got to do, and that is keep it real. Let's just say throughout the Western world, and please wag your finger at me if I'm wrong, David, the relationship that ordinary folks like me have with the medical establishment is a bit fraught. And COVID has actually only magnified that. That being said, alternative medicine has a stigma of being woo-woo. I go into all of this because I feel like for us to even begin to have a discussion, we have to address this head on. And as someone who writes extensively in this space, I would just love to hear your thoughts on whether what I'm saying, the description of the atmosphere that psychedelics as a treatment modality is coming up in is accurate. And if so, what do you think is behind it?
Yeah, those are great points, Scott. And I think it's particularly magnified all of what you've said in mental health, actually, compared to like other diseases. Because before I even became a journalist, back when I was like a scientist researching this area, I think it was just accepted for so long that the only thing on offer for people was basically antidepressants. Even though, like, so the
Right.
actual effectiveness of antidepressants is not that great, really. I think, for a lot of people, particularly with the most severe forms of treatment-resistant depression, antidepressants, they don't often work particularly well, and the side effect profile is like really high. But just for so long, it was a sense of this is all we have, basically, and compared to like other diseases, there's very little innovation, like kind of going on. And it's really, psychedelics has been so fascinating, probably one of the most fascinating, I think, advancements in all healthcare in the last 5 years, because, out of nowhere, suddenly we have this completely new avenue of treatments for like disorders like depression, anxiety, alcoholism, substance addiction, which just wasn't there before. And what's really, really exciting is we're seeing increasing numbers of clinical trials, which is showing like so that, these really can help like a lot of people for whom there isn't anything else.
Well, you raise an interesting point, though, because you're talking about these beginning to emerge within the past 5 years as apparently, or at least potentially, viable treatment for people who have things like depression. David, I've been honest with this issue since the very first episode of this show. I grew up in an environment that was very toxic. There's a lot of violence and chaos in my household, and it was depressing. And I was depressed, and I was stressed, and there didn't seem to be a way out. Yet, when I think about how wonderful it is that in the past 5 years, as you said, new ways of thinking about this are emerging, I've also got to say to myself, well, wait a minute. It's actually not really true, or it's not accurate to say that psychedelics just came out of nowhere. It's not like all of a sudden some alchemist somewhere turned lead into gold and all of a sudden we have psychedelics. I mean, part of what I've learned through hosting the show is that there have been people in indigenous cultures that have been using this for years. And let's not even get started on people like Jimi Hendrix. So, why now in terms of the relationship of Western medicine and the medical establishment to emerging on this? Is there money to be made? I think that maybe at the end of the day, that's sort of the question I'm secretly asking.
Yeah. I mean, there is undoubtedly lots of huge amounts of money to be made in psychedelics now. I mean, it's $1 billion industry, and it's going to become like increasingly in the next 5 years. But I think the whole evolution story of how, as you say, like so kind of psychedelics came to be is such a fascinating one, because what a lot of people don't realize is that compounds like LSD, MDMA, psilocybin, like the ingredient in magic mushrooms, they were mental health treatments being explored by the pharmaceutical industry back in the 1950s. But for about 40 years, these things just got completely lost, which is kind of crazy, like when you think about it. But I think, in some ways we can maybe blame Jimi Hendrix like a little bit for that, because it was that it's all Jimmy's fault, sadly. But
blame. That's what we're all about here. Just kidding.
But it was that kind of that culture like in the 60s, which basically kind of like led to sort of them almost being rebranded, and suddenly instead of being seen as mental health treatments and things which could affect people in a positive way, suddenly they began being tarnished with, like so kind of drug overdosing and risks and things like that. And so literally kind of, for about 40 years, like psychedelics just became a counterculture, and it's only been the last 10, 15 years actual scientists have like really, started to bring them back.
Again, let's keep it real though. As you said a minute ago, there's money to be made here, assuming the initial research on this bears out. And knowing how the pharmaceutical industry's understandable in a capitalistic society love of profit has impacted, at least in the public's eye, including my own sometimes. I'm a member of the public. The availability or the accessibility or the cost associated with them, knowing how that's played out, one of the things I can just imagine is that, okay, this wonderful good thing will be discovered and it'll be ruined because it'll go into some profit-making cog. And the accessibility or the ease of use that might have otherwise been available with this new treatment will be gone because people will have their greedy little fingers all over it. What would you say to that?
I say, Scott, I think it's a double-edged sword, because on one hand, let's say at the moment, Big Pharma are not in this space, but let's say, I mean, I know they're watching it very, very carefully. I was at a conference in San Diego last month, and I hosted a talk which is all about psychedelics, and there are people from like Merck, Pfizer, those big pharma giants, who are watching this space with interest. And if they do decide to move into it, then for sure, on one hand, costs probably will go up, and it might become inaccessible for some people. But then the complex issue is that on the other side of the coin, safety still is an issue with some of these things. And when it is at least in the hands of like a large company, you can be sure that it will be well regulated, and what you're taking, they have the money to put into these things to make it into like a regulated drug. So it's a tricky issue.
The Webdelics podcast exists to educate, illuminate, and inform. It does not provide medical advice or recommendations as to any course of treatment, mental health, or otherwise. You should always consult with a physician or other licensed healthcare professional, mental health or otherwise, before pursuing any personal growth program or course of treatment. Well, and I have to admit, there's real truth there. As much as I get frightened or scared or annoyed with the habits that I know about with regards to the pharmaceutical industry, I still feel better buying something from a pharmacy with a prescription from a doctor that's been approved by the federal government's drug regulatory agency than buying something from my homie down the street. I've got to say, as much as I might love my homie, sometimes these homies are kind of shady. I'm just saying.
Exactly. I mean, I think one interesting example is actually ketamine. Like the last 3 years, ketamine has suddenly boomed in terms of people have realized this is an amazing depression treatment for people who have like no other options. And, 3 years ago, 2019, there was a drug called esketamine that was approved
Hmm.
But then at this, and that is very regulated. If you take that, people, you know exactly what you're getting like with it. But then at the same time, wherever there's money to be made, you get the shady folks like also kind of move in as well. And we've seen like there's been like a bunch of like startup companies, particularly in New York, who are like posting like ketamine lozenges to people in the post and just like trying to get like as much ketamine into vulnerable patients as possible. And if you take too much ketamine, you can have too much of a good thing. It can cause like all sorts of problems. So there's one particular company like called Mindbloom. I think they're being investigated by like regulators in the US for doing this at the moment. So that is always kind of like the problem, like so whenever there's money to be made, you do get kind of some shady people moving into the space. And that's something which psychedelics very much has to watch out for, I think, in the next kind of 5 years.
Now, just sitting here watching you, talking to you, you seem like such a wholesome young man. How did a neuroscientist who's wholesome and smart and all these other things end up writing about psychedelics?
I mean, I think because I heard about some of his research a little bit while I was doing my PhD. There's like a couple of people we have here in the UK where I'm based, and they've been some of the pioneers in like driving psychedelics. There's a guy at Imperial called David Nutt. He's like a world leader in like driving this research. So I'd heard about it a little bit, but I was, back in 2016, 2017, I was still a little bit skeptical. Can psychedelics really be the answer for something as complicated as depression? But then the last 5 years, the studies have started to come in, and I'm still very interested in the latest neuroscience breakthroughs. And it started to capture my attention, and I was like, maybe there is actually something in this.
Now, the alternative term for psychedelics is plant medicine. And as we know, and as we've kind of discussed, right now, psychedelics are probably, and correct me if I'm wrong, sort of considered by people like me that aren't all that well informed as alternative medicine. And as I mentioned at the top of the hour, alternative medicine like homeopathy, shark cartilage to make sure you never get cancer, even cannabis, which allegedly can cure everything from aches and pains to, your refusal to like good music, I guess. All these sorts of things are out there. And then you just walk into any nutrition store and you see a zillion different herbs for everything that always seem to promise rejuvenation, life, the end of diabetes, immortality, godlike powers. How do we distinguish psychedelics from these other, some would say less than credible remedies, right? Like, what's the difference between plant medicine and an herbal remedy?
Yeah, I think this is quite an interesting question, and I think it's important to remember that not all psychedelics are the same. Let's say, I go on the black market and I order LSD from some guy in Mexico. That is more in the herbal medicine, like the kind of category rather than like the actual drug, because dose is critical, like to all of these things. When scientists take MDMA or one of these chemicals and they put it into a clinical trial, there's a huge amounts of steps which go into deciding what is the exact dose which you need, which is going to like actually make it effective. And also as well, let's say, so you buy one of these substances, from like a health store or something like that, you don't know what other chemicals might actually be contained like within it. And as part of that is part of like the security which big pharma do give you, and that at least exactly what you're getting. You're not getting some weird stuff like sort of kind of mixed in like with your drug, which might affect you in ways which you don't know.
Yeah, well, and that also raises another issue about psychedelics and their usage now, because although there are clinical trials around this going on, there are people throughout the Western world that are using these things, I wouldn't say on their own, but they're using them through channels that are not, let's just say, going to, the local hospital, or usually not in the local pharmacy or the local doctor's office. And so thinking about it, I mean, you're raising a good point. I went to a big drugstore just this weekend and got up on, got my big jars for super cheap of vitamin D. And I'm sitting here wondering as you're talking, oh my gosh, is there some weird stuff in that vitamin D? I'll just pretend there isn't because my little mind can't handle the thought that there might be. But your point really is a good one, that this stuff isn't really regulated. And black market, people that are doing this now with the absence of a regulatory superstructure in place. Are you saying that the regulatory superstructure might make this a less risky experience for them as well as everyone else? Or do you think it'll just be a barrier?
I think mainly it will help take some of the risk away. I mean, I massively sympathize for patients. Like if you have severe depression, there's very little options for you. So
Yeah.
you can see why people will fly to Mexico, fly to Holland, like so,
Yeah.
like do these things like so, with kind of private unregulated practitioners or do them on their own. People need relief. They need options.
Yeah.
And you do hear some amazing stories. I mean, one of the ones I find most fascinating is there's a compound called ayahuasca, which is in the psychedelic like known as DMT. And there's a lot of interesting science around DMT, but you get people like so going to, I think, these kind of like ayahuasca festivals in like the jungles of South America, who have people who've been like, I've heard stories of people who've been in the army and have severe PTSD, which has affected them for years or decades. And it works for them. They get relief that way. But at the same time, there is a little bit of a risk involved in that because you don't exactly know who is supplying it, what's in what you're taking. So I think the hope is for the future that if it does become regulated, people will at least have like a way of accessing it where, they can be completely confident in what they're taking.
It's interesting that you raise ayahuasca of all substances, because another difference, as I understand it, between many plant medicines, specifically those that are psychedelics, and your garden variety antidepressants, let's say, or other mental health medicines, is that to my knowledge, these medicines that are out there now ain't putting you on a trip. Yet, right? I hear people say, I went on a trip when I used ayahuasca or other things. This occurred during my trip, or they might couch it as an experience. So part of what I'm having a hard time wrapping my mind around, and I just feel like, David, I can't be the only person who gets suspicious that this is just like any other old medicine when there's a trip involved. Or is that just me being, I don't even know that I'm skeptical, because if there's anything I'm learning on this journey, I don't know anything anymore. But talk to me a little bit about the role of the trip and how that might even look in a more regulated clinical context. That's what I want to know.
I find a trip is one of the most fascinating parts about psychedelics. And it's something which has made a lot of people, like a lot of doctors, very uncomfortable with psychedelics over the last few years, because it's been like, yes, this is helping people, but people actually have to hallucinate and like get high, often for a long time, to experience the benefits. And there are quite a lot of people in the medical world who feel uncomfortable about that, and perhaps understandably so. But in terms of how it works, the first thing which is important to remember is that a lot of these compounds, it's not just taking the drug itself. To get the real benefits, you need to have psychotherapy at the same time. So it's a combination of like being there, like with a therapist, opening up and being vulnerable. And what a lot of these compounds seem to do is they basically disrupt like patterns of negative thought in the brain. Because the big thing which a lot of people who are, say, addicted to alcohol or depressed do is that they ruminate. They just, they get stuck in these patterns of thinking, I've been a failure. Why did I do that in the past? Why have I let myself down, other people down, things like that? And psychedelics, they seem to break up all of that. And so it means that when people talk to their therapist, they're able to make real progress, which they weren't able to before. But as part of the actual breaking down all those patterns of rumination, it seems that the trip is really important for that. And with things like psilocybin, the trip is a long time. We're talking like 8-10 hours, but it seems that you need that to really experience the full benefits.
And for anyone that might be listening to this podcast for the first time, tell us just what psilocybin is in case I haven't heard that word before.
Yeah, so psilocybin is probably the one we have of all psychedelics the most evidence for so far. So it's the active ingredient within magic mushrooms. So and
Gotcha.
when people take it, they almost have this euphoric kind of high. I've interviewed people
Mm.
who've had psilocybin as part of a regulated clinical trial, and they've described these almost out of body experiences. Where they're able to kind of detach themselves from traumatic things which have happened to them in the past.
I'm going to argue with myself for a minute. And if there's anything that is happening as I'm going on this journey and talking to folks like you, is that so many of the assumptions that I had about everything, about mental health, about my own psychological state, about medicine, it's being rejiggered. And this discomfort that you talked about with doctors and the existence of the trip, I can't help but wonder if maybe that's just because it's something that we as a society in which the Western medical culture is embedded haven't explored yet. It's something that's new and different. And maybe there's some block that's going on that's really within ourselves that's keeping us from being open to the possibilities of these sort of trips. I mean, listening to you, what you said, David, I was in therapy for 11 years. 11 years to deal with trauma related to my childhood. And you're right, there were times when I would do anything to get out of this stuck pattern of thinking that I had. A trip might have been something I was uncomfortable with or thought I was weird, but so was being stuck in this self-destructive state. And who knows? Any resistance or reluctance that I might have had to doing a trip to fix it really might have been within me. I mean, do you think it's possible that this sort of just resistance to the trip as having some sort of therapeutic value might just be purely a psychological block that a particular community has? Or do you think there's something deeper there?
I think it's a combination of a few things. I think some people are scared about it because,
Yeah.
it's something which can't be controlled. And, I think like so a lot of doctors kind of find that kind of quite difficult to accept that, you're actively letting the patient like so kind of hallucinate and lose control, and you as the doctor have no sense of control over anything they're experiencing as part of that trip. And also I think as well, a lot of it just relates back to the stigma associated with taking a drug and going on a trip. Like here in the UK, if you mention MDMA, I think the first thing people think about is not an anti-anxiety drug, but teenagers taking it in
Yeah,
nightclubs, festivals,
sure.
all the stories in the media about overdosing and things like that. So
Yeah.
people associate a trip with a very negative connotation, and that's a big challenge for the psychedelics industry. One which it really has to overcome, I think, for it to become truly mainstream.
Even thinking about common language. If someone says something outrageous to me, I'll be the first to have the following words come out of my mouth. You have got to be tripping, right? Think about what is embedded in the language assumptions, even in slang like that, that's out there that is commonly used. And you're right. Hey, I'm a former disco boy. I know all the stories, right? And we do hear about these sorts of things. The other thing, too, though, that's out there with regards to trips is you hear, at least I'm hearing as I'm going through this journey, and I think it's really exciting, is the sort of spiritual component to the treatment trajectory that people go on when they use psychedelics. Maybe not universally. I'm very much still learning, but you hear about it enough that it's sort of stuck in my mind. And do you feel like there's any sort of resistance in the scientific community to trips or psychedelics as treatment modalities because of the association with the spiritual?
I think so. I think, the scientific community has a very uneasy relationship with the spiritual because, it's very much like the unknown. It's something which you can't
Yeah.
control. It's very hard how do you measure that empirically? Kind of science is a world of like hard facts and hard truths. And the idea that, someone is kind of like going on a trip, which allows them to kind of let go of the trauma they've had in the past. You can't put a number on that. You can't measure it. I think that's been one of the things which has been a big barrier, and it's only been fairly recently when we've actually been able to do detailed brain imaging scans of what is going on in the minds of these patients, both before and after the trip, and the differences we're seeing in patterns of brain waves. That's the first thing which has really started to get a lot of scientists actually genuinely excited about these things.
The Webdelics podcast exists to educate, illuminate, and inform. It does not provide medical advice or recommendations as to any course of treatment, mental health, or otherwise. You should always consult with a physician or other licensed healthcare professional, mental health or otherwise, before pursuing any personal growth program or course of treatment. As a journalist, part of your job, again, correct me if I'm wrong about this one, but please don't tell me I am, is to be able to translate these scientific concepts into a way that a layperson can understand. So I would love to hear some general thinking from you about, in a way that us less scientifically sophisticated folk can wrap our arms around, as to what the medical case around psychedelics is looking like in terms of its impact on the brain and what happens when those changes to the brain occur.
Yes, so it's a very interesting one. I think the main thing is, as I said like a little earlier, it's a lot about just disrupting negative thought processes. Particularly in like parts of the brain which play a very important role in terms of regulating emotion. So what happens a lot of the time with disorders like depression is that you actually get like a die-off in the brain in terms of like connections between cells, which is why so much of the brain is often just like trapped in these like repeated cycles of thought. And the brain can't get out of that. It can't make new patterns. And so that just keeps you kind of like trapped down there. But what psychedelics allows is almost for the brain to kind of spring free. It allows the growth of new connections, which allow kind of new and more positive thought processes, which emerge when you speak with your therapist to take hold. And that's why that people they experience this relief. They're able to get out of constantly thinking about, the bad things which happened to them in the past and focus on new things, because those old connections in their brain have been broken. I think that's like the best way of like seeing it, just like breaking the bad patterns of thought from the past.
David, I want to thank you so much for putting it that way, because that actually really spoke to me. Being caught in a rut and suddenly having something that enables you to spring out of that box. I think if there's one takeaway that I'm going to leave this episode with, it's that metaphor for what psychedelics can do. I also probably am going to really take away a lot of thinking around the relationship between medical regulation and that issue that so many people have about psychedelics, which is safety, as well as rethinking assumptions that I've had about brain paradigms and how the thinking that we have can or can't shift. And if we're willing to take that shift and follow where the evidence leads, we could be opening a lot of doors to take away a lot of misery that people like me went through for a long time. David, is there anything that you would like us to take away, either that you've mentioned so far or that you haven't had a chance to talk about, that you'd like to share with us as sort of a parting word?
I mean, I think this, honestly, for me, it's one of the most fascinating areas of medicine. And as a journalist, I can't wait to see what happens with psychedelics over the next few years. I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities, and a lot of people are going to be helped. And I can understand people being skeptical about, big pharma and like sort of increasing control. But I think, people shouldn't be scared about that, because I think as big companies get into this space, it will just open it up to like more people in a safer way. So I think that's the future of it all.
And really, that is a way of thinking about this that had never occurred to me before this episode. And it is, again, one of the joys of being able to go on this journey with amazing and insightful people like you. David, anyone that watches or listens to this episode is going to want to learn more about you. And as someone that did research on you, yes, I snooped around your life before you came on this show. I have to say that your body of work is impressive. Where can people find out more about you? Where can they follow you?
Well, if you want to see any of my latest stories, the best place is my Twitter. My Twitter handle is at Dr. David A. Cox, and you'll find everything which I write on there as it happens.
It's a feed well worth following. David, it's been great having you on the show today. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your wisdom. It's truly been revelatory. Now, for those of us who are listening or watching, keep tuning in. In upcoming episodes, we're going to be discussing the social concerns related to psychedelics, their relationship to everything from religion to race relations. We're going to talk about psychedelics and the law, which is something I think I'm curious about, especially with that thing called arrest. It's something that can happen to people. We're also going to talk about one of the most important considerations of all, and we've touched on this a little bit today, but we're going to dive into this in a great amount of detail later, which is safety. It is going to be a truly revelatory journey that we go on. I'm learning a lot, and thanks to people like you, David, that learning and the expansion of the mind is, if anything, accelerating. Now, if you enjoyed today's episode and want to learn more, be sure to subscribe, leave a review or a comment, and tell the folks you care about what we're doing. And don't forget to follow Webdelics on Instagram, on TikTok, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. And be sure to check out our website, webdelics.com. That's WEBDELICS.com. And sign up to get our blog for trusted educational information about plant medicine on the web. And join us next time for another episode of the Webdelics Podcast. The Webdelics Podcast exists to educate, illuminate, and inform. It does not provide medical advice or recommendations as to any course of treatment, mental health, or otherwise. You should always consult with a physician or other licensed healthcare professional, mental health or otherwise, before pursuing any personal growth program or course of treatment.